On the afternoon of August 13th, 1948, at approximately 2:47 p.m., the architect of the modern global financial system collapsed in his bedroom and died. Harry Dexter White, 56 years old, had been resting at his summer residence in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, when his heart failed. His wife, Anne, had been in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a heavy sound from the bedroom. Not quite a crash, more like something settling onto the floor. She found her husband lying on his back near the bed, his face pale, his breathing shallow and irregular. She called for their daughter Joan, who was visiting for the week. Together they tried to revive him, but Harry Dexter White was already dying. A local physician arrived shortly after 3 p.m. and pronounced him dead at approximately 3:17 p.m., according to the death certificate. 3 days earlier, White had sat before the House Un-American Activities Committee in Washington and denied, under oath, that he had been a Soviet spy. The evidence declassified 50 years later would prove he had lied. The timing of White's death would fuel speculation for decades. He had been the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Department, the principal architect of the Bretton Woods international monetary system, and one of the most influential economic policymakers of his generation. He had also, according to decrypted Soviet intelligence communications that would not be revealed until 1995, provided classified information to Soviet intelligence for nearly a decade. He died facing potential criminal prosecution as evidence built against him and his reputation collapsed. Whether the stress killed him, whether his death was coincidental, or whether there were other factors remains unknowable. What is certain is that Harry Dexter White died before he could be fully confronted with what he had done, before he could explain his understanding of his own actions, and before the people who trusted him could learn the full truth. Before we continue with how intercepted Soviet cables and the testimony of defectors exposed one of the most influential intelligence sources in American history, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are turned on. We bring you these deeply researched Cold War cases every week, uncovering the documented truth behind the most consequential secrets of the intelligence wars. Harry Dexter White was born on October 9th, 1892, in Boston, Massachusetts, the youngest of 7 children born to Joseph White and Sarah Magilewski, Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who had arrived in the United States in the 1880s. Joseph White anglicized the family name to White shortly after Harry's birth and operated a hardware store in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood. The family belonged to the lower-middle-class immigrant community that characterized much of the city's urban landscape in the late 19th century. White attended Boston public schools and showed early academic promise, particularly in mathematics and economics. After graduating from high school in 1911, he worked in his family's business and various clerical positions for several years. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1917 after America entered World War I, served in France as a lieutenant, and was discharged in 1919. At age 28, White enrolled at Columbia University in New York to study economics. He completed his bachelor's degree in 2 years, earned a master's degree from Columbia in 1924, then transferred to Stanford University. He completed his doctoral dissertation in 1930 on French international financial accounts, demonstrating the analytical rigor that would define his government career. He taught economics at Lawrence University in Wisconsin from 1930 to 1932, then joined Harvard's faculty in 1932. In June 1934, Harry Dexter White left academia and joined the United States Department of the Treasury as an economic analyst in the Division of Research and Statistics. The position was relatively junior, but White's analytical abilities quickly brought him to the attention of Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr., a close personal friend of President Franklin Roosevelt. Morgenthau was not himself an economist. His background was in farming and business, and he relied heavily on technical advisors. Over the following decade, White became one of Morgenthau's most trusted advisors, eventually ascending to Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, the department's second highest position. White's rise coincided with extraordinary economic and geopolitical transformation. The United States was recovering from the Great Depression. Nazi Germany threatened Europe. Japan pursued military expansion in Asia. The Soviet Union underwent Stalin's brutal industrialization. In this environment, economic policy was inseparable from foreign policy and national security. White's work placed him at the center of these interconnected issues. By 1938, White had been promoted to Director of Monetary Research within the Treasury Department. In this capacity, he developed policy responses to the international financial crisis accompanying the approach of World War II. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Roosevelt administration faced the challenge of supporting the Allied powers while maintaining official neutrality. White was instrumental in developing financial mechanisms to support Britain and, after June 1941, the Soviet Union in their war against Nazi Germany. These mechanisms included currency stabilization agreements, loans, and eventually the Lend-Lease program. It was during this period, between 1938 and 1945, that White crossed the line from government economist to Soviet intelligence source. The exact chronology would not be understood until decades later, when U.S. and Soviet archives were partially opened and when the VENONA project was declassified. The VENONA project was a highly classified U.S. Army signals intelligence program that intercepted and eventually decrypted Soviet intelligence communications sent between Moscow and Soviet diplomatic facilities in the United States during the 1940s. The intercepts were fragmentary. Many messages were only partially decrypted, and code names made definitive identification difficult. But when the VENONA material was declassified in 1995, it provided compelling evidence that Soviet intelligence had penetrated multiple U.S. government agencies during World War II and the early Cold War. Among the VENONA intercepts were references to a source codenamed jurist or lawyer who provided information to Soviet intelligence on Treasury Department matters, international monetary negotiations, and U.S. economic policy. The intercepts showed jurist providing advance information about U.S. negotiating positions at international conferences, advising Soviet contacts on how to structure requests for American economic assistance, and sharing copies or summaries of classified Treasury Department memoranda. The details in these communications matched White's position, access, and activities closely enough that intelligence historians concluded jurist was Harry Dexter White. Soviet intelligence documents retrieved from Moscow archives that became available to researchers after 1991 provided additional corroboration. These files indicated that White had been considered a valuable source who provided information willingly and whose relationship Soviet intelligence cultivated carefully to avoid exposing him to detection. The intermediary who facilitated initial contact was Whittaker Chambers, a former communist who worked as a courier for Soviet intelligence networks in Washington during the 1930s. Chambers would later become famous for his testimony against Alger Hiss, but in the late 1930s he was introducing government officials to individuals connected to Soviet intelligence. The meetings were framed as discussions among progressives concerned about fascism and the need for international cooperation. According to Chambers's testimony given in 1948, White understood that information he provided would reach Soviet contacts, though White may have rationalized this as contributing to the anti-fascist alliance rather than as espionage. This distinction matters because it speaks to how individuals like White understood their own actions. During the 1930s and early 1940s, the Soviet Union was widely viewed by progressive intellectuals as a counterweight to fascism. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Soviet Union became a critical ally of the United States and Britain. Sharing information with Soviet contacts could be framed, and may have been genuinely understood by White, not as betraying American secrets to an enemy, but as facilitating cooperation with an ally fighting the same foe. The question is what information White provided, and whether it constituted espionage in the legal sense. White was not providing military secrets about weapons systems, troop movements, or battle plans. He was sharing information about economic policy, diplomatic strategy, and bureaucratic deliberations. According to the VENONA intercepts and Soviet files, White provided information on U.S. negotiating positions before international financial conferences, advised Soviet officials on how to structure aid requests to maximize approval likelihood, and shared Treasury Department memoranda discussing post-war economic planning. Some of this information was classified, though much was not. The information could give the Soviet Union advantages in negotiations with the United States, but it could also be argued that better-informed negotiations between allies might serve American interests by strengthening the anti-Nazi coalition. This ambiguity would be central to White's testimony in 1948 and to debates about his legacy that continue today. In July 1944, Harry Dexter White served as the primary American architect of the international conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, that established the post-war international monetary system. The Bretton Woods Conference brought together representatives from 44 allied nations to design institutions and mechanisms that would govern international finance after World War II. White's plan, developed over years of detailed analysis, called for creating the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which later became part of the World Bank Group. The IMF would provide short-term financial assistance to countries experiencing balance of payments difficulties, while the World Bank would provide long-term loans for reconstruction and development. The Bretton Woods system also established the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. The conference represented a diplomatic and technical triumph. White chaired the American delegation and managed complex negotiations involving countries with vastly different economic situations and strategic interests. The agreements reached at Bretton Woods would shape the global economy for decades. At the same time, according to Soviet intelligence documents that became available after the Cold War ended, White provided Soviet representatives at the conference with information about U.S. negotiating positions and strategies. Whether this constituted espionage or simply informal information sharing that occurs in any complex international negotiation remains contested. In 1945, President Harry Truman nominated White to serve as the first U.S. executive director of the IMF, the position that would make him the American representative to the institution he had created. However, the nomination became complicated by reports from the FBI that White might have been involved with Soviet intelligence operations. The FBI had been investigating suspected Soviet espionage networks since the early 1940s. By 1945, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had accumulated reports from multiple sources, including Whittaker chambers and Elizabeth Bentley, a former Soviet courier who had defected and provided information to American authorities. Both sources suggested that White had maintained contact with Soviet intelligence. Hoover provided this information to the Truman administration. Truman faced a difficult decision: White was highly competent, and his expertise was needed for the IMF position. The evidence against him was substantial, but not conclusive. Some came from sources whose credibility was questionable. Chambers and Bentley were both former communists and former Soviet operatives whose testimony might be motivated by personal factors. The FBI's reports contained allegations but not proof meeting legal standards for prosecution. Truman proceeded with White's appointment, possibly calculating that it was better to have White in a position where he could be monitored rather than leaving him in the Treasury Department with access to current classified information. White assumed his position at the IMF in May 1946. However, his tenure would be brief. His health deteriorated through 1946. He suffered from hypertension and heart disease, conditions exacerbated by stress and overwork. In early 1947, White resigned from the IMF and retired from government service. The accusations did not end with his retirement. In 1948, as the Cold War intensified and domestic concerns about communist infiltration increased, the House Un-American Activities Committee launched investigations into alleged Soviet espionage networks. Whittaker Chambers testified before the committee in August 1948, naming several government officials, including Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White, as having been involved with Soviet intelligence in the 1930s and early 1940s. White was subpoenaed to testify on August 10, 1948. Despite his poor health and friends' advice that he might avoid the hearing on medical grounds, White decided to appear. He wanted to defend his reputation and deny the accusations publicly. The hearing took place in the Old House Office Building in Washington in a large committee room packed with reporters and spectators. White, visibly unwell, took his seat at the witness table at 10:30 a.m. He wore a dark suit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost weight in recent months. His face appeared pale, and witnesses later recalled that his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Committee Chairman J. Parnell Thomas of New Jersey called the hearing to order. White's testimony lasted 3 hours, interrupted by breaks and questions from committee members. He denied categorically that he had ever been a member of the Communist Party, that he had ever been involved with any communist organization, or that he had ever provided classified information to any unauthorized person. He acknowledged knowing some individuals named by Chambers, but characterized these as professional relationships or casual acquaintances rather than participation in any espionage network. When asked about specific meetings Chambers had described, White either denied they had occurred or stated he had no recollection. When pressed about his political views and whether he sympathized with communist ideology, White replied that he had always been a loyal American, that his work in government had been dedicated to serving the national interest, and that he resented the implication that policy disagreements or progressive political views should be conflated with disloyalty. His voice, though firm at the beginning of his testimony, became increasingly strained as the hearing continued. Committee members responded with varying degrees of skepticism. Some treated White's testimony as credible, noting that Chambers's accusations were based on events a decade earlier and that memories could be unreliable. Others suggested White was being evasive, that his denials were too categorical to be believed, and that his refusal to acknowledge even minor associations suggested he was hiding something more significant. The hearing concluded shortly after 1:30 p.m. White left the building visibly exhausted. Reporters who observed him noted that he appeared pale and unsteady. Friends who spoke with him after the hearing later recalled that he had been deeply shaken, not because he felt guilty, they insisted, but because he felt his life's work and reputation were being destroyed by accusations he considered false or grossly distorted. 2 days later, on August 12th, White traveled to his summer home in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, hoping that rest would help him recover from the stress and the ongoing strain on his heart. On the afternoon of August 13th, he collapsed and died. The timing immediately sparked speculation. White's death came just 3 days after testimony in which he had denied accusations of espionage. If the accusations were true, and if White had been considering whether to confess or provide more information to investigators, his death eliminated that possibility. If the accusations were false, and White had been an innocent man, subjected to political persecution, his death could be seen as a tragic consequence of Cold War paranoia. If the truth lay somewhere between these extremes, if White had cooperated with Soviet intelligence but had rationalized it as legitimate policy cooperation rather than espionage, his death meant he would never have the opportunity to explain his understanding of his own actions. The FBI's investigation continued after White's death. Agents examined evidence, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed documents seized during searches of residences and offices connected to suspected espionage networks. The Alger Hiss case, which resulted in Hiss's conviction for perjury in 1950, overshadowed the White case in public attention. But FBI counterintelligence officers continued piecing together what White had done and how his activities fit into broader Soviet intelligence operations against the United States. For decades, the debate about Harry Dexter White's loyalty remained unresolved. Those who believed he had been a Soviet spy pointed to the testimony of Chambers and Bentley, to FBI reports documenting his contacts with suspected Soviet intelligence operatives, and to policy positions that sometimes seemed to favor Soviet interests. Those who believed he had been innocent or unfairly accused pointed to the lack of any criminal prosecution, to the questionable credibility of ex-communist informants, to the possibility that professional contacts had been mischaracterized as espionage, and to the political motivations of congressional investigators during the early Cold War. The declassification of the VENONA intercepts in 1995 substantially changed the debate. The intercepts provided compelling evidence that Soviet intelligence had maintained contact with a source matching White's position and access. The code name Jurist appeared in multiple messages discussing Treasury Department matters, IMF negotiations, and U.S. economic policy. While code names in intelligence communications can be ambiguous and intercepts can be misinterpreted, the correspondence between Jurist's activities and White's position was strong enough that most intelligence historians concluded the identification was correct. Documents from Soviet intelligence archives in Moscow that became available to researchers after 1991 provided additional corroboration. Files indicated that White had been considered a valuable source who provided information willingly and whose relationship Soviet intelligence managed carefully. However, these same documents suggested important qualifications to the narrative of White as a Soviet spy. White was never a recruited agent in the formal sense. He was not paid for his information. He did not receive training in espionage tradecraft. He did not use codes, dead drops, or elaborate security measures that characterized professional intelligence operations. His contact with Soviet intelligence appears to have occurred primarily through intermediaries at social occasions or policy discussions rather than through clandestine operational meetings. The information White provided consisted primarily of economic policy rather than military secrets. A distinction some historians argue matters, though it remained illegal and damaging. White's motivation appears to have been primarily ideological rather than financial. He seems to have believed, at least at times, that sharing information with the Soviet Union served the broader goal of international cooperation and the defeat of fascism. Whether this belief was genuine or served as rationalization for actions he understood to be wrong remains unknowable. human motivation is complex, and individuals are capable of holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously, of believing they are serving a higher purpose while also knowing they are violating their obligations. The impact of White's activities can be assessed on several levels. Regarding immediate damage to U.S. national security, the impact appears to have been limited. White did not provide information that led to military defeats, compromised intelligence operations, or resulted in loss of life. The economic and policy information he shared may have given Soviet negotiators advantages in some discussions, but it did not fundamentally alter the course of World War II or the early Cold War. Regarding institutional damage, White's case contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in government security during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The revelation that senior officials in the Treasury Department, State Department, and other agencies had maintained contact with Soviet intelligence fed public anxiety about communist infiltration and provided political ammunition for figures like Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose accusations often went far beyond available evidence. Regarding personal consequences, the impact was profound and extended far beyond White himself. His wife, Anne, spent the remaining 22 years of her life defending a husband whose actual activities she may never have fully understood. She published articles and gave interviews portraying her husband as a victim of Cold War hysteria, arguing that his progressive political views and advocacy for international cooperation had been deliberately mischaracterized as disloyalty. She died in 1970, still defending his innocence. Their daughters, Joan and Ruth, grew up under the shadow of their father's alleged espionage. Both were questioned by FBI agents at various points during the 1950s, though neither was accused of wrongdoing. Joan, who had been present when her father died, rarely spoke publicly about the case. She married, had children, and lived quietly, declining all interview requests from journalists and historians. She died in 2003. Ruth eventually moved to France in the 1960s, living there for many years, partly to escape American preoccupation with her father's case. Ruth's later life remained private, with reports placing her in France as of the early 2000s. The broader question raised by the Harry Dexter White case is how to understand ideologically motivated cooperation with foreign intelligence during a period when the line between ally and adversary was shifting. During World War II, the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States in the fight against Nazi Germany. Information sharing between Allied governments was not only acceptable but necessary for effective cooperation. The problem was that some individuals, including White, continued or expanded their cooperation with Soviet intelligence during a period when U.S.-Soviet relations were deteriorating and when the information being shared could be used against American interests. This raises difficult questions about judgment, loyalty, and responsibility. When does information sharing with an ally become espionage against one's own country? When do ideological convictions about international cooperation become rationalizations for betrayal of trust? When does pursuit of what one believes to be a higher good justify violating laws and obligations? White's case illustrates the problem of compartmentalization, the ability to maintain separate mental frameworks for different aspects of behavior. White was simultaneously a dedicated public servant building institutions to serve American interests and a source providing information to Soviet intelligence that could undermine those interests. He was capable of brilliant economic analysis while violating his security obligations, a devoted husband and father while maintaining secret contacts that, if exposed, would destroy his family. This cognitive dissonance is not unique to espionage cases, but in intelligence operations, the consequences extend far beyond the individual to affect national security, institutional integrity, and the lives of family members who may have no knowledge of the hidden activities. The FBI's investigation into White and related cases led to significant changes in government security procedures. Background investigations became more thorough and frequent. Polygraph testing became more common for individuals with access to classified information. Counterintelligence training was expanded to help security officials recognize potential warning signs of espionage or unauthorized contacts with foreign intelligence services. However, these procedural changes could not resolve the fundamental challenge of protecting classified information in a system requiring thousands of individuals to have access to sensitive material to perform their jobs. Every security system depends ultimately on the judgment and loyalty of the individuals within it. When those individuals decide, for whatever reason, that their obligations to a foreign power or to an ideology take precedence over their obligations to their own government, no amount of procedural safeguards can provide absolute protection. The question of how to evaluate White's life and legacy remains contested. Some historians emphasize his genuine contributions to international economic policy and argue that his cooperation with Soviet intelligence, while wrong, was motivated by idealistic beliefs about international cooperation rather than by malice or personal gain. Others argue that his activities, regardless of motivation, constituted espionage that damaged American interests, and that his legacy is therefore fundamentally compromised. What seems clear is that White was neither a simple hero nor a simple villain. He was a brilliant economist who made genuine contributions to public policy while also engaging in activities that violated his obligations. He was motivated by a complex mixture of idealism, ego, political conviction, and rationalization. He believed, or convinced himself that he believed, that he was serving a higher purpose even as he betrayed specific duties. The question of what would have happened if White had lived is impossible to answer but worth considering. If he had survived his heart attack in August 1948 and had faced prosecution for espionage, would he have confessed? Would he have maintained his denials? Would he have offered explanations that tried to distinguish between espionage and information sharing with an ally? Would he have expressed remorse or continued to insist he had done nothing wrong? The answers matter because they would have affected how his case was understood by history. A confession and expression of remorse would have made him a tragic figure who had made serious mistakes, but who ultimately acknowledged responsibility. Continued denial in the face of evidence would have made him seem defiant or self-deluded. An attempt to explain and contextualize his actions might have provided insights into how ideologically motivated sources understand and rationalize their cooperation with foreign intelligence. Instead, his case became frozen at the moment of his denial before Congress and the subsequent emergence of evidence suggesting he had not told the truth. This combination of circumstances has made his legacy particularly contested and difficult to resolve. For Anne and her daughters, the ambiguity was painful in ways that clear guilt or clear innocence would not have been. If White had been definitively proven guilty and had confessed, they could have grieved and moved on. If he had been definitively proven innocent, they could have celebrated his vindication. Instead, they lived in uncertainty, with strong evidence suggesting guilt, but without the closure that a trial and verdict would have provided. Joan and Ruth spent their lives as the daughters of a man accused of betraying his country, unable to confirm or deny the accusations, unable to escape the shadow of their father's alleged crimes. The question of responsibility requires distinguishing between different types of harm. White bore responsibility for his decision to provide information to Soviet intelligence, regardless of how he rationalized that decision. He knew he was violating security protocols. He knew he was maintaining contacts he had not disclosed to his superiors. He knew the information he provided could be used in ways that might disadvantage American interests. His rationalizations about serving international cooperation or preventing war were exactly that, rationalizations allowing him to avoid confronting the implications of his actions. At the same time, White's case occurred within a context that shaped the choices available to him and the meaning of those choices. During the 1930s and early 1940s, the Soviet Union was seen by many progressive intellectuals as a necessary counterweight to fascism. The idea of sharing information with Soviet contacts could be framed as contributing to the anti-fascist struggle rather than as betraying one's country. This framing was always questionable, and it became indefensible after the wartime alliance ended and the Cold War began. But it was a frame that was available and that White and others like him appear to have used to justify their actions to themselves. The Soviet intelligence officers who cultivated and handled White bore responsibility for exploiting his ideological convictions, his ego, and his apparent belief that he was contributing to a worthwhile cause. They framed their requests for information in ways that made cooperation seem like political solidarity rather than espionage. They reinforced White's sense of importance and his belief that he was making meaningful contributions to history. They created relationships that blurred the lines between friendship, intellectual exchange, and intelligence operations. The U.S. government bore responsibility for security failures that allowed White and others to maintain unauthorized contacts for years without detection. Background investigations were inadequate. Compartmentalization of information was insufficient. Oversight of employees with access to classified information was lax. These systemic failures created opportunities for espionage that individuals like White chose to exploit. None of this absolves White of personal responsibility for his choices, but it suggests that understanding espionage cases requires attention to both individual agency and systemic context. People make choices, but they make them within situations shaped by political systems, institutional structures, ideological frameworks, and historical circumstances. Harry Dexter White was 56 years old when he died on August 13, 1948, 3 days after denying under oath that he had been a Soviet spy. The evidence that emerged decades after his death proved he had lied. He had cooperated with Soviet intelligence for nearly a decade, providing information that violated his security obligations and betrayed the trust placed in him. Whether he understood this as espionage or as something else, as political solidarity, as informal diplomacy, as contribution to international cooperation, remains unknowable. What is certain is the human cost. The destroyed reputation, the grieving widow who spent 2 decades defending her husband's memory, the daughters who lived their lives in the shadow of accusations they could neither confirm nor deny, and the broader damage to institutional trust that cases like this inevitably produce. White died believing or claiming to believe that he had been a loyal American falsely accused. The truth was far more complicated and far more tragic than he was willing to admit.